It was a warm night in September of 1978 when a Forest Service employee named Robert Hicks was driving a fire access road deep in the Cascade Mountains of Washington state when his headlights caught something standing at the edge of the tree line that made his hands lock on the steering wheel. He described it later to investigators as 7 feet of muscle and dark hair, standing perfectly still, watching him the way a predator watches something it has already decided is not worth chasing. He did not stop the truck. He did not roll down the window. He drove straight through the night with his heart slamming against his ribs, and when he finally reached the ranger station, he sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes before he could make himself walk inside and tell someone what he saw. Hicks was not a hoaxer. He was not chasing fame. He was a government employee with a mortgage and a reputation, and he almost lost both because he told the truth about 5 seconds in the dark that he could not explain. His story is one of more than 10,000 that have accumulated across North America over the last 100 years, and until recently, nobody had ever tried to make sense of all of them at once. That changed when a team of researchers decided to feed the entire body of evidence into an artificial intelligence system and ask it a simple question. What is actually happening in this data? What came back did not just reignite an old argument. It rewrote the terms of the debate entirely, and it left both the believers and the skeptics with far more questions than they started with. For well over a century, people across this continent have reported encounters with something that, according to mainstream science, simply should not exist. Witnesses describe a massive, upright, bipedal creature, somewhere between 7 and 10 feet tall, covered head to toe in dark hair, moving through dense forest with a speed and a silence that seems almost impossible for something that size. The reports do not come only from campers with overactive imaginations. They come from off-duty police officers, licensed hunting guides, forest rangers, surveyors, and ordinary families on weekend hikes who had never given cryptozoology a second thought until the moment their entire understanding of the woods around them was upended. The overwhelming majority of professional scientists dismiss these accounts outright. The official position of mainstream biology has not shifted in decades. No large, undiscovered primate species is believed to exist in North America. The continent has been mapped, surveyed, and cataloged. If a 7-foot ape were roaming the Pacific Northwest, the argument goes, we would have bones by now. We would have a body, a skull, a single tooth in a museum drawer. Instead, we have thousands of stories and a handful of blurry photographs. And for most of the scientific establishment, that is the end of the conversation. That dismissal has shaped the entire field for generations. Cryptozoology, the study of animals whose existence has not been confirmed by mainstream science, is treated by most academic institutions as somewhere between a joke and a liability. Researching Bigfoot seriously is treated as professional suicide for anyone hoping to keep a university position or a research grant. No respectable biologist wants their name attached to a subject that instantly triggers ridicule, even if the underlying question, is there an unclassified species living undetected in North American wilderness, is not inherently unscientific. But what if the entire framing of the question has been wrong from the beginning? What if the reason nobody has found conclusive physical proof is not because there is nothing there, but because we have been looking for the wrong kind of thing in the wrong kind of way? What if the raw pattern of sightings, when examined at scale, reveals something that no individual investigator, however dedicated, could ever have pieced together by hand? In a project that began gaining attention in 2024, a small team of independent researchers set out to test exactly that idea. Rather than debate whether Bigfoot exists, they decided to treat the sightings themselves as raw data and see what an unbiased analytical system could extract from it. They compiled a database of more than 10,000 documented encounters spanning over a century, drawing on multiple independent sources. This included the archives maintained by long-running Bigfoot research organizations that have logged and cross-checked witness reports since the 1990s. It included digitized newspaper archives stretching back to the 1800s, when accounts of wild men and hair-covered giants occasionally made regional headlines decades before the word Bigfoot even entered common usage. It included oral histories from numerous indigenous nations across the continent, many of which describe a being with names like Sasquatch, a word derived from the Halkomelem language of the Coast Salish peoples, as well as other regional names carrying centuries of tradition behind them. It included Forest Service incident logs, wildlife agency notes, and even police reports where officers on duty had filed formal accounts of something they could not identify or explain. The researchers made careful, deliberate choices about what to include. They filtered out any report that was an admitted hoax, anything that lined up cleanly with a known animal like a bear standing on its hind legs, and anything that showed signs of fabrication for attention or profit. What remained was a set of accounts from witnesses who came across as credible under scrutiny, whose descriptions were specific rather than vague, and whose stories held up consistently across repeated retellings over years. This filtering drew criticism from both directions. Skeptics argued that including any Bigfoot report in a serious data set lends false legitimacy to something that does not deserve it. Believers worried that filtering out implausible-sounding reports might discard genuine encounters simply because they described something too strange for comfort. The team acknowledged both critiques and pressed forward anyway, because their actual goal was never to prove or disprove the creature's existence. Their goal was to see what the raw pattern of the data looked like once analyzed, without the emotional baggage that has followed this subject for 100 years. If the sightings were nothing more than noise, random misidentifications, and campfire stories, the analysis should reveal exactly that. No structure, no correlation, no consistency. If the reports were a wave of coordinated hoaxes, you would expect suspicious clustering tied to media coverage or internet trends. But if something real was actually being observed and reported, the data should behave the way real phenomena behave. It should follow patterns. The AI system was given the full data set, including location coordinates, dates and times, weather conditions at the moment of the sighting, terrain and vegetation type, witness demographics, and detailed behavioral descriptions pulled from written statements. It ran several layers of analysis in parallel. Geographic clustering algorithms mapped where sightings concentrated most heavily and cross-referenced those clusters against terrain features, vegetation density, and nearby human population. Temporal analysis broke the sightings down across multiple timescales at once: time of day of the week, season of the year, phase of the moon, and long-term trends spanning decades. A separate correlation engine compared sighting locations against geological survey data, water sources, known wildlife migration corridors, and historical land use records going back generations. On top of all of that, the system ran natural language processing across the written witness statements themselves, hunting for recurring descriptive elements, behaviors, sounds, and physical details that kept showing up again and again across reports that had no connection to one another. Two witnesses, separated by 50 years and 2,000 miles, who used almost identical language to describe what they saw, were exactly the kind of signal the researchers were hoping the AI could surface. The analysis took several weeks to complete, and when the results finally came back, they did not comfortably fit either side of the existing debate. The first major finding involved geography, and it went well beyond what anyone had previously mapped. It has long been understood in general terms that sightings cluster in the Pacific Northwest, throughout the Appalachian mountain chain, and across parts of the upper Midwest and the Canadian provinces. That much was already common knowledge among people who follow the subject. What the AI uncovered was a far more precise structure underneath that broad pattern. Sightings clustered tightly along specific geological corridors, rather than simply following forest cover or habitat quality. These corridors lined up with known fault systems, underground aquifers, and networks of natural caves at a rate the researchers say cannot reasonably be explained by chance alone. According to the analysis, sightings were significantly more likely to occur within 5 miles of a major fault line than random distribution would predict, and reports clustered near known cave system entrances at rates far exceeding what you would expect if location were simply driven by dense forest and low human traffic. That result was genuinely unexpected, and it complicates the simplest explanation for what Bigfoot might be. If this were purely an undiscovered great ape living quietly in remote wilderness, you would expect its presence to track with habitat suitability: thick vegetation, minimal human interference, and a reliable food supply. Instead, the strongest predictor turned out to be geology, not ecology. Whatever is generating these sightings appears tied to the underground structure of the landscape in a way conventional biology struggles to explain. A flesh and blood primate has no obvious reason to prefer territory near fault lines and cave networks, but something with a different relationship to the subsurface environment might. The second major finding centered on timing, and this is where the pattern became even harder to dismiss as coincidence. Sightings are not spread evenly across the calendar. They spike sharply in late summer and early autumn, and drop off dramatically once winter sets in. On its own, that seasonal swing has a boring, obvious explanation. More people are outdoors when the weather is pleasant, so there are simply more opportunities for an encounter to happen and be reported. But when the researchers controlled for human recreational activity, adjusting for how many people were actually out in the woods at any given time of year, the seasonal spike did not disappear. It held steady. Something beyond simple foot traffic appears to be driving the timing of these events. Even stranger was what the AI found when it examined the lunar cycle. Sightings were significantly more frequent during the days surrounding the new moon, when nights are at their darkest. And this pattern repeated consistently across different regions, different decades, and completely different groups of witnesses who had no way of coordinating with one another. And, buried inside the long-term data, the system identified something nobody had previously documented at all: a rough 7-year cycle of rising and falling sighting frequency that has repeated with striking consistency since organized record-keeping began. No known wildlife population cycle matches that rhythm. No climate pattern lines up with it either, and it does not correspond to any obvious human behavioral trend. It is simply there in the numbers, appearing with a level of statistical consistency that would satisfy standard scientific thresholds in almost any other field. Some have pointed out that 7 years is roughly a quarter of the 18.6-year lunar nodal cycle, the astronomical rhythm behind long-term tidal behavior on Earth. Whether that connection is meaningful or simply coincidence, nobody can currently say, but it adds one more thread tying these sightings to natural cycles that have nothing to do with human activity. The third major finding may be the most unsettling of all because it deals directly with behavior, and behavior is much harder to fake consistently across thousands of unconnected witnesses over 100 years. When the natural language processing ran across the written descriptions themselves, it surfaced a level of consistency that is genuinely difficult to explain through hoaxing or simple misidentification. Witnesses from wildly different backgrounds, different decades, and different parts of the continent describe strikingly similar behavior. The creature is repeatedly described as observing people before it has ever noticed itself, watching silently from cover for extended stretches of time before finally being spotted. When it is detected, the near-universal pattern is retreat rather than confrontation. Its movements are consistently described as deliberate and controlled, not the panicked scramble of a startled wild animal bolting for safety. The vocalizations reported are especially consistent across the dataset. Witnesses independently describe distinct wood-knocking sounds, long howls that do not match any known North American wildlife call, and a rapid chattering vocalization that some researchers have nicknamed samurai chatter because of its clipped, almost language-like rhythm. These exact descriptions appear in accounts from the 1920s and in accounts filed within the last year. They appear in reports from rural Washington state and from swampy corners of Florida. They come from hunting guides who know every native animal call in their territory by heart and from city dwellers who had never set foot in real wilderness before that night. In total, the AI cataloged more than 40 distinct behavioral elements that recur consistently across the entire dataset. Specific body postures, specific reactions to being noticed, specific use of terrain for concealment, and patterns that resemble deliberate communication. That level of consistency leaves only two real possibilities. Either thousands of independent hoaxers across a full century somehow coordinated their fabrications down to matching highly specific details, which stretches credibility past the breaking point. Or a very large number of witnesses really did observe something real that behaves in genuinely predictable ways. Perhaps the most striking pattern the AI identified, one researchers have started calling avoidance intelligence, is that whatever is being observed appears to be actively evading documentation. Sighting frequency drops in direct correlation with local trail camera density and smartphone saturation. As cameras and phones have become nearly universal, reports have steadily shifted toward more remote, less monitored terrain, almost as though the phenomenon itself is retreating from the growing web of technological surveillance. That does not line up with how wild animals typically respond to increased human presence over time. Wildlife usually becomes habituated to cameras rather than more elusive. The pattern found here runs the opposite direction, suggesting either situational awareness, far beyond any known primate, or something operating by an entirely different set of rules. The fourth major finding pushed the investigation into territory that most Bigfoot researchers have historically avoided, because it connects these sightings to a wider category of unexplained phenomena. When the AI cross-referenced sighting locations against other unrelated datasets, it surfaced correlations nobody had specifically gone looking for. Sighting hotspots showed meaningful overlap with regions that have recorded unusual magnetic field anomalies. They overlapped with areas where people have separately reported unexplained aerial lights, erratic animal behavior, and unexplained equipment failures. They clustered near sites that multiple indigenous nations' oral traditions specifically identify as spiritually significant, or, in some traditions, as places to be approached with caution. None of this proves anything definitive about what Bigfoot actually is, but it does suggest that whatever is behind these reports might be part of a broader pattern of unexplained activity rather than an isolated, self-contained zoological mystery. One correlation in particular caught the research team off guard: a measurable relationship between sighting density and elevated natural infrasound. Infrasound is low-frequency sound below human hearing, and it naturally occurs around geological activity like fault movement, volcanic processes, and severe storms. Separately, infrasound exposure has been documented elsewhere to produce feelings of unease, disorientation, and a sense of unseen presence in people exposed to it, even when nothing is actually there. Areas with the highest sighting rates also showed elevated natural infrasound levels. Perhaps infrasound makes people more prone to misinterpreting ordinary stimuli under stress. Perhaps infrasound-heavy environments attract whatever is generating these sightings for unrelated reasons. Perhaps the phenomenon itself produces infrasound as a byproduct. The analysis could not distinguish between these explanations, only confirmed the relationship exists and is too strong to write off as chance. Taken together, this is a body of findings that satisfies neither side of the traditional argument. The data does not support the idea that Bigfoot sightings are simply noise generated by 100 years of hoaxes and honest misidentification. The patterns are too consistent, too tightly correlated with specific environmental variables, and too evenly distributed across a full century of independent witnesses for that explanation to hold up. But the data equally fails to support the simplest counterargument, that Bigfoot is just an undiscovered great ape quietly living in the deep forest, waiting for the right expedition to finally catch up with it. The geological correlations, the lunar and 7-year cycles, the avoidance intelligence pattern, and the overlap with other unexplained phenomena all point towards something considerably stranger than an unclassified biological species that has simply been lucky enough to avoid a camera trap for 100 years. The analysis nudges toward a possibility that most researchers, on either side of the debate, have historically been reluctant to entertain seriously. That the Bigfoot phenomenon may not fit neatly into any of our existing categories at all. It may not be a straightforward flesh and blood animal. It is very likely not a century-long chain of coordinated hoaxes either. It may be something that our current scientific frameworks simply are not built to classify. That conclusion is deeply unsatisfying to almost everyone with a stake in this debate, and that is exactly why it has proven so controversial. Skeptics want the numbers to confirm randomness and fabrication, a tidy conclusion that closes the case. Believers want confirmation of a living, breathing biological species finally waiting to be formally classified by science. Neither side is comfortable with the result suggesting the phenomenon appears to be genuinely real in some sense, yet resistant to easy explanation within the frameworks either side has been arguing from. The researchers behind the project have been careful about how they present what they found. They are not claiming to have proven Bigfoot exists in the traditional sense. They are not claiming to know what the creature actually is. Their claim is narrower and, in some ways, more interesting. That the pattern of 10,000 sightings is measurably inconsistent with casual dismissal, and that the correlations uncovered point towards specific, testable avenues for future investigation, rather than dead ends. Some of those avenues are already being explored. Independent researchers are examining the geological correlation in more detail, testing whether cave systems and fault corridors might function as natural travel routes or shelter for an undiscovered species, rather than simply being an odd statistical coincidence. Others are digging deeper into the infrasound connection, trying to determine whether it plays a causal role or is simply a byproduct of the same geological conditions that produce the fault line correlation in the first place. Still others are focused on the avoidance intelligence pattern, trying to understand how any phenomenon could consistently evade a documentation network as dense and pervasive as the one that now blankets nearly every populated region of North America. This new wave of analysis has also renewed interest in indigenous oral traditions surrounding beings like Sasquatch and the many regional names carried by different nations across the continent for generations. These traditions frequently describe something considerably more layered than a simple undiscovered animal, being sometimes described as having a spiritual dimension, or as moving in ways that place them partially outside the boundaries of ordinary physical reality as commonly understood. None of this necessarily implies anything supernatural in a religious sense. It suggests instead that the full phenomenon may involve aspects of the natural world that contemporary Western science has not yet built the tools or the frameworks to properly measure or explain. Physics itself has a long track record of discovering that reality is stranger and less intuitive than common sense would suggest, most famously with the emergence of quantum mechanics nearly a century ago, which upended assumptions about causality and locality that had held for centuries. It is not unreasonable to consider that a poorly understood biological or ecological phenomenon might behave in ways that feel similarly counterintuitive once it is finally examined closely enough. The 7-year cycle remains the single hardest piece of this puzzle to explain. Biological populations naturally rise and fall over time, but rarely with this kind of mathematical regularity. Waves of hoaxing might plausibly track with cultural attention or media trends, but not with a rhythm this precise, sustained across a full century. Long-term climate variation could influence animal behavior broadly, but no 7-year climate cycle has ever been identified that would account for this specific correlation. Whatever is driving that 7-year rise and fall in reported encounters, it does not match any explanation currently on the table, and that alone is enough to keep serious researchers looking rather than closing the file. Reaction to these findings has been exactly as polarized as anyone following the subject would expect. Skeptics argue that running sophisticated analysis over inherently unreliable eyewitness data simply produces sophisticated-sounding conclusions built on a shaky foundation, no matter how advanced the tool doing the analyzing happens to be. Believers, meanwhile, treat the findings as validation of everything they have argued for decades, proof that something real has been out there in the forest the entire time. waiting to be taken seriously. Both reactions arguably miss the actual point of the exercise. This analysis was never designed to hand down a verdict of proven or disproven. It was designed to identify constraints, to narrow down which explanations remain plausible and which ones the data actively rules out. What it found is that the pattern of sightings is inconsistent with a dismissive explanation of pure noise and fabrication, while also being inconsistent with the simplest biological explanation of an undiscovered great ape quietly living in the woods. Whatever is actually generating these reports appears to be neither meaningless static nor conventional unclassified species, and sitting with that uncertainty, rather than forcing it into one of the two existing boxes, may be the most intellectually honest place any of us can currently stand. What does any of this actually mean for how we understand the wild places on this continent? It means forests that people have walked through for generations, forests we assumed had already given up their secrets, maybe hiding something considerably stranger than anyone previously guessed. It means the tens of thousands of ordinary witnesses who have come forward over the last century, hunters, rangers, police officers, hikers, families on weekend trips, may genuinely have been describing something real rather than simply misremembering a bear or embellishing a story around a campfire. It means indigenous oral traditions describing these beings across many nations may be preserving genuine ecological or environmental knowledge that mainstream Western science has been too dismissive to seriously engage with until now. And it means the question that has defined the subject for 100 years, does Bigfoot exist, may have been the wrong question from the very start. The more useful question may be, what category of phenomenon could possibly produce the specific patterns identified across 10,000 independent reports? Nobody has that answer yet. But for the first time, there's a body of structured evidence pointing toward where that answer might eventually be found, not scattered randomly across the surface of the forest, but tied to the geological structures running beneath it, concentrated in the darkest nights of the lunar cycle rather than in daylight, and connected to a wider web of unexplained phenomena that science has too often dismissed as unworthy of serious attention. What this analysis accomplished that a century of individual investigators never could was scale. No single researcher, however dedicated, could hold 10,000 reports spanning 100 years and countless independent witnesses in their head at once and reliably spot patterns buried that deep in the noise. What emerged does not hand either side of this debate a clean, comfortable victory. It leaves us instead with the uncomfortable but honest acknowledgement that something is happening in the wilderness of this continent that current explanations do not fully account for. Something consistent enough to leave a measurable fingerprint across a century of data, and strange enough to resist every simple category we have tried to force it into. That may be the most truthful conclusion anyone has reached on this subject in 100 years of arguing about it. Not proof, not dismissal, just the acknowledgement that the mystery is real, that the patterns in the data are real, and that whatever the eventual answer turns out to be, it is likely to be far stranger than the story we have been telling ourselves all along. The forests, it seems, are still keeping secrets, and the only question left is whether we are actually prepared for what we might find if we finally go looking.